Welcome, everybody, to the Green Side Podcast. I'm glad to be back. I have a very special guest with me, Matthew Heineman. He's a documentary filmmaker. You might have seen his little docu made on Netflix called Cartel Land. I've seen it, I think, 3 times before I even knew you, so that's how much I liked it. You got nominated for an Academy Award for that. You also went on to do City of Ghosts, which was about a citizen journalist out of Raqqa, Syria. Also very compelling. And he's done all kinds of other docs. But right now, he's finally went on and done his first full feature movie called A Private War. And we're happy to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've prepared for this, and I've seen a bunch of interviews you've done, and you've described kind of your trajectory. And if you could just a bit describe how you even decided to become a filmmaker, because you weren't a film student, correct?
No, I studied history here. My first, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and my senior year, I was sort of sitting around and thought I wanted to be a teacher. I applied for Teacher America, got rejected. Most people didn't know you could get rejected from Teacher America, but I was one of the lucky ones. And I just decided to go on this road trip around the U.S. with 2 of my buddies from Dartmouth to try to understand what our generation's about. And that was my first film. That was my film school. I bought a camera and taught myself as I went. And through that whole process, just fell in love with filmmaking, and that led to my first job at HBO and led to sort of everything that I've done since.
With all the success that you've had, do you think the 2004, 2005 Matt could ever have dreamed, you'd be back here on campus screening a feature film that you directed? Would that have just been a mind-blowing realization, you think?
Yeah, it's strange. I don't think I had any sense of where my life is going to go. When I was 21 years old, I heard Al Maisels, sort of a mentor of mine, speak, and he said that if you end up with a story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way. And I think that's good advice for life, and I think that's good advice for filmmaking. It's be open to the story changing, be open to the sort of wonderful accidents of life. And that's something that I've held true to my heart at every step along the way, both in sort of, my career choices and sort of the ethos by which I make films as well.
Now let's talk about the career choices you've made, because Cartel Land is not in a setting that is safe. You're with, as you can probably guess, cartels. How did you even come up with the idea, and how did you get access to cartel members and the autodefensias, like counter-revolutionaries or whatever you call them?
So there's 2 sides of the story. I basically followed vigilante groups on both sides of the border, quote unquote, fighting against the Mexican drug cartels. And the U.S. side of the story is where I started, based on a Rolling Stone article that I'd read. I spent about 6 months gaining the trust of my protagonist, Naylor, and then filmed there for about 4 months. Then my dad actually sent me this article about the Autodefensas, a group of sort of citizen vigilantes in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, who rose up to protect themselves and fight back against the Knights Templar cartel. And when I read this article, which my dad sent sort of more intellectually, like, oh, this is interesting, not like, oh, you should go down there. I was like, wow, this is amazing, and quite an interesting parallel to what I was filming on the other side of the border. And so I reached out to him, and then went down there about a week later, and 1 week became about 9 months. I was there on and off for sort of 9-10 months, and I thought I was telling this story about freedom fighters. I thought I was telling this story about people rising up to fight against evil, and slowly I realized that I was telling a story about those who are fighting against evil becoming evil. And it was quite a extraordinary experience. I'd never been in, I've been in some sketchy situations before, but nothing like what I experienced in making Cartel Land. I was in shootouts in the middle of the streets of Michoacan. I was in torture chambers. I was in meth labs in the dark desert night. A bunch of places that I never could have ever imagined being in.
Did you realize the level of danger you were going to put yourself in once you started the story? And as you're approaching danger, you just kind of think, well, I guess I got to go with it now? Did you ever think maybe I need to just leave and figure out a different way to tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was never about the danger. It was never about like, the thrill of danger or sort of getting off on being in those situations. Is always in the service of the story. And, the fact is that, I fell in love with the people of Michoacan. I fell in love with the people that I was filming with. And in this sort of daily cycle of violence, was a reality that they lived with. That's why they rose up to sort of try to get rid of the cartels. It was almost sort of like the Wild West. I mean, the government wasn't protecting them, and so they felt like they had to rise up and protect themselves. And so this violence was just a factor of daily life really down there. And so to not capture that would have been doing a disservice to the story. And so, all of those moments that I described, to me, were really important and holistically putting people on the ground, putting audience members on the ground in those situations to feel the terror, to feel the horror that the citizens of Michoacan lived with every day.
It makes me think, you went on to do City of Ghosts, which is about the citizen journalists out of Raqqa, Syria, and you did a lot of filming of their safe houses in Turkey, and then they fled to Germany. So you're repeatedly putting yourself in harm's way, and it's in the service of the story. But have you, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, given serious thought to your own mortality and the fact that you're very realistically putting yourself on the line for the story? And I know you want to do them justice, but have you given deep thought to your mortality in filming?
Definitely after the fact. I mean, this as well as I do, is that, when you're in it, you're sort of focused on the task at hand, and you're focused on, for me, in my case, I'm focused on focusing. I'm focusing on exposing and framing on the sort of aspects of filmmaking, making sure the record button's on, so
Yes.
so that, I think, those focusing on that really calm me down in these otherwise, extraordinarily frightening and chaotic situations. But yeah, of course, I mean, it definitely, more so after the fact, as I said, makes you think about who are we in the world we're living in, and life and death, and yeah, it's definitely something I've thought about a lot, and honestly, in the case of Cartel and in the case of City of Ghosts as well, is probably a lot of guilt as well for having a blue passport, for being able to leave the violence. That at any point, if I wanted to leave, I could leave. And yes, there are cartels obviously throughout this country. There's cartels in the city that I live in New York. But the idea of them sort of coming after me in New York City is not really a reality. I mean, maybe, but not really. And so, that guilt of being able to leave the violence and come home to safety is something that I felt bad about for, a very long time.
Do you feel an enormous pressure to do justice by your subjects? I'm sure you do. But I mean, how do you ensure that you're doing the story justice? And do you ever feel there's ethical lines, or maybe there's something you shouldn't capture? One really compelling scene to me in City of Ghosts was you catch, I can't remember his name, but you catch one of the guys in his apartment, and he's having this kind of trembling PTSD fit, and kind of like, it's like a sleeper drops his phone. There's all these different scenes where they're really struggling, and you can see the physical effects of all the trauma they've been through. And I know you probably just keep filming, but do you feel in those moments, or especially in the editing room afterwards, this pressure to just create the perfect story, to do those moments the justice they deserve?
I think my job is, or I guess I feel like my job is, to take issues that people think they understand, issues that are sort of ripped from the headlines, and people are often sort of overwhelmed by, and try to humanize them, try to put a human face to them, try to take audiences into these faraway lands and make you care and think and empathize with the people that are going through something. And I think that's what really motivates me to make films like this, is to create that empathetic connection to issues that might seem so far away but aren't. And I think a big part of that obviously is the style with which I do it, which is very intimate. verite documentary filmmaking, putting, filming people in the most sort of extreme of circumstances, filming people in the most personal of circumstances. And a big part of getting that access is trust, is building trust and rapport with your subjects. And it's also time. It's not sort of helicoptering in and out for a day or two and saying like, hey, can I film you, and then leave. It's spending weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months building that rapport so you can get those really intimate human moments, so you can get to a place where you just become a part of the fabric of their daily lives, where they don't really know that you're there. They know that you're there, obviously, but that it's not a distraction. It's not a, they can really let their guard down and be themselves. In the scene that you referenced in City of Ghosts, that film was originally about something that was, quite clear in my head. It was a film about propaganda. It was a film about this group of Syrian activists who rose up to dispel the myths that ISIS was propagating around the world, that it's just a safe haven for Muslims, and and they were showing the human rights atrocities that were being committed by ISIS on a daily basis, and they paid an enormous price for that. A number of their members of their group and family members were killed, were assassinated, some of which were idolized in ISIS videos, and so for me, that's what I thought the film was about. I thought the film was about this sort of propaganda war between this group of activists and ISIS on one hand, but ultimately it became a story of brotherhood. It became a story of an immigrant story of as they were forced to flee, and it was about this sort of exodus, moving from safe house to safe house as they're escaping ISIS, first to Turkey and then ultimately to Europe. It became a story about rising nationalism in Europe as well. And it also became a story about PTSD and the cumulative effects of trauma that these guys had experienced. And so that final scene where, we see one of our main characters sort of break down and was really, really important to show that, what this had done to these men. And Syrian men are quite emotive, but they really don't like showing weakness. Mm-hmm. And so it took a long time to be able to get to that moment where he sort of broke down.
Right. Now, you're in these situations yourself. You obviously have your own life and your own experiences. Do you...
Life or wife?
Life.
Yes.
Do you have a wife?
I don't have
a wife. So you have your own life, your own experiences. Do you ever want to incorporate them, or do you work very hard to remove your bias from your film? And is that even really, truly possible to remove all bias and all perspectives and not, not have who you are? Then there's other documentary filmmakers who had the style, like Ben Anderson. I've watched some of his stuff when he goes to Afghanistan or he embeds, and he has a cameraman filming him and he's talking. He's very much a part of it. And you obviously deliberately make a choice not to do that. Yeah. I guess, why do you do that? And do you ever struggle to keep yourself separate?
I just don't find myself that interesting. And I try really, really hard to be, keep my own opinions and biases out of my films. I think the world's divided enough, polarized enough. I think that the beauty of film is to really bring people together. And I think, the films that are sort of polemics or essays, and that just sort of preach to the choir aren't that interesting to me. You just sort of literally chop off half of your audience, and why do that? Why not create a conversation? To me, that's the best of films. Transport you to this world and immerse you in it, and instigate conversation. And that's what I love about making films. There's nothing wrong with those other types of films. That's just not what I like to do.
Right. Well, now you've done a different type of film. You've done a feature film, and I'm sure there's plenty of overlap, but it is a deviation from doing strictly documentary filmmaking. One, you're the director. I also figured there's a lot more hands in the pie, a lot more people involved, more money. One, why and how did you choose to make this film? And two, with that, did you worry about losing some control over the film? Would there be too many inputs, too many voices, and you would lose your vision?
It was a totally different experience. With my docs, I'm used to being out there alone or with a tiny crew. I'd never been on a film set before, to sort of walk out for the first time and have, hundreds of people staring up and saying, look at me as to what to do. It was definitely a strange thing, but it was amazing. But completely different. And when you're making a doc, you're cognizant of money, you're cognizant of a budget. You have to be, but not on sort of a minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis. And sometimes you are, but most oftentimes you're not. But with a narrative film, every single decision has a dollar sign attached to it, whether you want to turn the camera this way or that way, or do another take. Hey, we can do that, but we might miss that scene later. Are you okay to miss that scene later? If we miss that scene later, where are we going to move that scene? Or we're going to move it later, where are we going to move it? So it's much more of a sort of puzzle. And that's true whether it's a $5,000 film or a $50 million film. And it's just a reality. That sort of intersection of art and commerce was strange to me. But ultimately, I tried to bring my documentary ethos into that process as much as possible. I tried to create an environment where real life could occur. I tried to create an environment where improvisation could occur. There's a scene that takes place. The film's about a journalist, a sort of famous war correspondent, Marie Colvin, who wrote for the Sunday Times of London, who ended up dying in Syria, and it's about that sort of draw to covering war and what that did to her mentally and physically. And there's a scene in Iraq where we arrive that day and just a blank field, and she uncovers this mass grave. And one of the things I really wanted to do is work with non-actors, to work with refugees from the various countries we were depicting. So we shot all the war zones in Jordan, and so these women that were there, that were sort of reliving the trauma of this moment, were real women, really from Iraq. They weren't actors, shedding real tears, and it just was, it almost felt like a documentary verite scene. We moved the camera around with Rosamund Pike, our lead actress, as she was interviewing different people. And it was just so exciting because it felt like I was actually, capturing this real scene. And obviously it was set up, but it was great to be able to sort of bring my background and my experience from my docs into this moment. And at the end of the day, these women start pounding their chests and doing this prayer for the dead. And, that wasn't scripted and that wasn't planned, but it was just sort of this beautiful moment. Later in the film, in Homs, Syria, where she ultimately dies, the women that she interviews in the shelter were real women from Homs, from Syria, telling their own real stories, and again shedding real tears. The second woman that she interviews says, "I don't just want this to be words on paper. I want the whole world to understand what we're going through." And that's her speaking to a quote unquote Hollywood actress, but that's her speaking to all of us. There's a scene after that where a young man brings in his 2-year-old boy who is hit by a bomb and ends up dying on the table. And the trauma and the grief that this man brought in onto set was almost unbearable. He also was from Homs. His 2-year-old nephew was shot off his shoulders at a protest in Homs and bled out in front of him. And again, just the grief and the gravitas that he brought into that room just was really hard to handle. And Rosamund Pike, who played Marie, at one point walked off set and said, I don't know how to handle this. Like, I don't know where to put my emotions. The sort of lines between documentary and fiction are so blurred. What are we doing? Are we exploiting this man? And I said to her, no. There's so many times in my documentary career where I've wanted to sort of give someone a hug or to give them space, but my job is to capture these moments. as it was Marie's job, as it is your job. So, he wouldn't be here if he didn't want his story to be told. And so melding those two genres, narrative and doc, was really exciting for me.
Absolutely. And I've seen the film, Private War, and having my own experiences in Afghanistan, seeing, people live, die, and especially locals. A lot of times young children will die as a result of, IEDs and bomb blasts. And there is a unique type of, mourning or sound or scream that someone makes in an actual life or death situation that is, I think, near impossible to replicate if it's not really happening. But I will say in your film, as I was watching that, it just very much felt like something that I would experience back in Afghanistan, especially the sounds of a mother grieving a child or something. I think that's one of the worst things that could happen to anyone, losing a child. And to me, it did seem very powerful and realistic, and knowing the backstory that those were actual people who are essentially reliving their trauma on the screen for you is amazing. I think it's very brave of them and tough I'm sure for them to relive that. I mean, when those extras are there, I guess, how do you find them? And you have this responsibility towards everyone, including them. It's hard to watch them relive that. I mean, when you say cut, I mean, do you run up and give them a hug? Do you have like their favorite donuts on set? Like, what do you do to kind of bring them back?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely hard, and it was definitely a strange experience. Excuse me, because I'm used to being in those situations, in real life, as opposed to sort of trying to replicate real life. But I spent, weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks interviewing different people to quote unquote play those roles. I wanted to find people that would sort of emote authentically, that had, again, real stories from those various places, but that I also knew that could perform, quote unquote, on that day. So, it was just definitely a strange dance. And we had very candid conversations. This is a narrative film. This has actors. We were trying to replicate emotions, but I want to do so authentically. And they very much appreciated that. I think so many times in that part of the world, Arabs are terrorists or bad guys or bad women, and the opportunity to pay homage to the countries that they're from, was quite moving for them. And so, yes, I was quite nervous, and I didn't want them to feel exploited, but ultimately they were all honestly quite grateful to be able to do this and to take part in it.
Right. It makes me reflect as a young man who went to Afghanistan at 20. I very much had I guess you don't necessarily have to, but I had a particular worldview. And then later on, I got to work for the government under Homeland Security and asylum work. And I was the official who would be at the window when pending asylees or their attorneys could come in and make inquiries into their case. And oftentimes they're dealing with people that are very emotional or sometimes upset because their case is stalled or what have you. And that was really important just for me personally, because there's certainly some people that can irritate or anger you, but for the most part, I was very inspired by a lot of the refugees, asylees, pending asylees that you meet. And in particular, there was 2 Syrian single mothers that their cases kept getting snagged, or we kind of lost them, so it's kind of on us, and I helped find them and try to get their case back on track. And you can't root for anybody, but secretly, personally, of course, you're like, man, I had a single mom, I feel for them, and when they're in front of you, it's like these are just normal people trying to get food and shelter, and for one, without going into too much detail, one woman got to stay, and then the other one did not, and you feel in different ways for both of them, and I think that was really important for me to experience that and gain that perspective, because although we would stop and chat with local Afghanis a lot, it's a different dynamic when I'm holding a rifle. I have a grenade in my chest, and I'm a Marine in your village. And it was a little more, I guess I'm still a government official. It's not quite equal, but I don't have a weapon. So that kind of would change the tone of the conversation. That was very important for me. I saw in a different interview you did that you mentioned that Paul Conroy, who's kind of like Marie Colvin's photographer, and that's the actual guy. He's played by Jamie Dornan. How do you say it?
Jamie Dornan.
Dornan, there it is. And you said that he was on set all the time or frequently or every day, or was having that person that you're portraying helpful, or was it intimidating to have the person on set kind of like, well, that's not actually how it happened? Or did you find it extremely enlightening or reassuring?
For an actor like Jamie, or any actor really, to have the real life person there on set is quite an intimidating thing. Often, some actors are just like, no, it's not happening. So I was a bit nervous about whether that dynamic would work. Paul, Conroy, the real Paul Conroy is an amazing, just big-hearted, funny, sort of weathered guy, and he just got along with Jamie quite well, and so they became close friends almost immediately. And so Paul was a consultant on the film, and originally he was supposed to be there for a couple of days and ended up never leaving. So he was just a huge inspiration, not just to Jamie but to Rosamund and to myself and to the entire crew, as this living, breathing example of why we were making this film. And he was extraordinarily helpful with all the different departments and helping with my goal of trying to make it authentic as possible. And for me, the film is sadly quite timely. It's an homage not just to Marie, but to journalism. At a time when journalism is under attack, at a time when certain people in power are denigrating journalists. I think it's so important to be celebrating people who are out there fighting for the truth, people who are out there, shedding light on dark corners of the world. And, that's what Marie did. Marie had this amazing ability to go to places that seem so far away and to get people to stop and to care. And that's something that tormented her as well, is, are my words, are these stories making a difference? And she suffered dearly from it. She suffered dearly from PTSD, progressively so as her career went on, which we depict in the film. And that's another thing, honestly, that was quite important to me, is that it's something that I suffered from a bit, and I don't think PTSD has really been explored too often in films, or at least well. And so depicting PTSD and the moral injury of war was really important to me.
So someone who has only known you for maybe an hour, I'm obviously seeing some parallels. Did you see yourself a bit in some capacity in Marie Colvin, and is that why you chose to direct this screenplay? Because I think I've heard you say previously you had a lot of different offers coming in and different things come across your desk, and you're like, nah, but this one stuck out to you. Is it because there's some similarities there? Yeah,
of course. I mean, I think it spoke to me in a really profound way. It felt really timely, and it was really personal. Like it felt like I could bring something unique and special to the story. And I guess in some way, again, the story is never about me, and I keep myself out of all my films. But I guess in some ways it was partially a self-examination as to why I do what I do, as well. Marie covered war for decades, and was in so many sketchy and dangerous situations. I've been in some myself, not nearly as long as she has, but I very much empathize with what she's gone through, and what she tried to do with her career before she was killed.
I think, not that this is the entire point, but it is a good note to make, is the importance of self-care. And you see, like you said, her progressively suffering from PTSD. Has making this film made you reflect on yourself and how you engage your own self-care, being that you frequently expose yourself to danger in your line of work? Did it cause you to pause and reflect on how to deal with some of that in your own life?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think over the past couple of months, I've definitely been in a probably a more introspective place, and taking stock of where I am in my career and what I've done, and how I want to move forward.
Speaking of moving forward, what is next? You've already done so many amazing things. What's next? And I don't know, do you feel pressure at all to keep performing at a high level, or do you just see things like that looks interesting, I'll do that?
I don't think I feel external pressure. I feel a ton of internal pressure, I guess. I feel, again, extraordinarily lucky to be able to do what I do, to be able to tell stories, to be able to go to places and have people open up their lives to me. And I don't take that lightly at all. And so, I feel like, just pressure to keep telling stories that matter. Right now I'm doing a series for Showtime on human trafficking. I'm potentially looking into doing a film in Afghanistan. I prefer not to go into details about, but I'm developing a narrative film about a very specific story from a woman who survived the Paradise Fires in Northern California, and sort of supporting other filmmakers as more of an executive producer role, and helping other people who are younger than me, tell stories as well, which is sort of a fun place to be in my career now, that I can, help people like, a lot of people help me. So, that's really fun to be able to do as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited from everything you've just described to see what you come out with next. I did a lot of deep diving and hours worth of watching your docs. I already had previously, but I caught up on some more of them, and fantastically done. I love City of Ghosts, obviously, telling that story is so important. I loved Cartel, and you had this juxtaposition of these two characters, and they were so complex, and you loved them, then you were like, and then you didn't like them, and you liked them again. It's such interesting subjects, and A Private War was just fantastic. And, once you know the background of little things like the extras you chose and the people you had on set to, advise you, and having a great cast, obviously it turned out really well. And me personally, having not experienced all those things, but something in a similar realm, I thought it was just great, the extras you had, and you could tell the passion they had, or the real pain. I mean, I sensed it having seen it in real life, and I thought that was very well done. I want to thank you for coming to the podcast. It's been fantastic, and I wish you the best of luck in everything else you're doing after this.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.